also lost my water.
Did I steal it?
Okay, everyone, I'd like to begin. Is the mic actually?
Yeah, just 1 second. I'll give you a signal.
Okay.
Always called you Professor Sullivan. Do you pronounce your name Elaine or Elaine?
Oh, it's mystery.
It's a mystery.
I
Okay.
usually say Elaine. My mother says Elaine.
Okay. It's kind of weird to like forget. Like I forgot Stephanie's name.
Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Dale, and I'm the Simona and Jerome Chazen Distinguished Chair in Art History and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Research in the Humanities. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel, which is entitled Rethinking Race and Colonialism. Why am I struggling with that? Rethinking Race and Colonialism in Pre-Modern European Art and Contemporary Museum Practice. Although the traditional understanding of race as an immutable, biologically determined classification of human difference is not supported by any current scientific research, it remains a very powerful cultural construct that has been used since antiquity as a tool of enslavement, colonization, and empire, and until recently has conditioned narratives in museums as well. Since race is intimately tied to appearance and visual images is tied to appearance and behavior, visual images offer powerful techniques for reinforcing racial domination as well as resistance. And their erasure can be equally potent. We have witnessed this potency in the clashes over the Confederate monuments in the wake of George Floyd's death in 2020, inspiring both acts of iconoclastic destruction and removal and white nationalist veneration. And within the past few months, revisionist narratives of American art and history that consider racial bias have been singled out for censure by presidential executive orders, including the Smithsonian's recent exhibition, The Shape of Power: Stories of Race and American Sculpture, as well as didactic materials at national historical sites, such as the photograph of a former enslaved man, Peter Gordon, at Fort Pulaski in Georgia. Our panels today offer broader art historical perspectives on race and its intersection with enslavement, colonization, and empire, from the European Middle Ages to the present. I'm joined by two UW-Madison alumni, Drew Narayanan, Assistant Professor of Art History at Appalachian State and a recent PhD from our program, by Tanya Tiffany, Professor of Art History at UW-Milwaukee, also an alum of our program as an undergraduate, and by two faculty members from our department, Gail Geiger, Emeritus Professor of Early Modern Art, who I want to single out for teaching our department's first courses on race and gender in early modern art. And Elaine Sullivan, our dear colleague, recently arrived this past year, who is Assistant Professor in Art History and African Cultural Studies. We start with brief presentations, and then we'll devote about the last 25 minutes of our session to discussion, when we will be welcoming questions and comments from the audience. I'm going to start the ball rolling with a glimpse of my research on medieval Venice, and then we'll move on to Thirumular Drew Narayanan, And then from there, Gail Geiger will be in some ways in dialogue with her former student, Tanya Tiffany. And then Elaine Sullivan will take up the question of the museum context for narratives of race. Visible markers of difference seem deceptively simple to discern in official images from 14th century Venice. At left, a carved capital from the Doge's palace, the seat of the Venetian government, depicts a turbaned black African with protruding lips. And at right, the missal of Andrea Dandolo, used at the Doge's church of San Marco, depicts turbaned Arab Muslims alongside a black African, violently attacking Venice's patron saint in Egypt. Well, physiognomy, skin color, costume, violent behavior are all obvious visible markers of difference. I argue that these images reveal more subtle markers of racialization connected with ancient theories of environmental determinism and medieval genealogies of race. Although the term race, race in French, only originated in 15th century France to denote bloodlines of hunting dogs and horses, a growing scholarly consensus in medieval studies and early modern studies now embraces race as a powerful concept for articulating pre-modern difference. Geraldine Heng encourages us to consider the concept of pre-modern racial thinking, arguing that race is, quote, one of the primary names we have to demarcate human beings through differences that are selectively essentialized, to distribute positions and powers differentially to human groups, end of quote. Medievalist Cord Whitaker specifies that, quote, the black and white split that defines race in the modern West is the result of the Middle Ages, especially the Crusaders' insistence on the purity and innocence of Christians and the sinfulness and depravity of Muslims and other non-Christians, end of quote. Returning to the capital from the Doge's palace, difference is depicted using distinct physiognomies and headgear, to be sure. We see recognizable types, a turbaned black African with flattened nose, protruding lips, and a Mongol Tatar in a fur-lined cap with narrow eyes, wavy hair, and beard. A second capital depicts a wider range of ethnicities with inscriptions identifying them as a Persian, Latin, Turk, Hungarian, Goth, and Egyptian. Most scholars emphasize how these images reflect Venice's expansive trading network and multicultural empire. Venice had traded in the Middle East since the early 9th century, when its merchants stole the relics of St. Mark the Evangelist from Alexandria in Egypt. After leading the Fourth Crusade in 1204, Venice established an Eastern Mediterranean empire, colonizing parts of mainland Greece and Crete, which became a way station for Venetian merchants traveling both to North Africa and the Black Sea, where they encountered Tatar Mongols, Turks, Black Africans, and Mamluks. Familiarity may thus explain these relatively, although still conventionalized, naturalistic images, which contrast with the caricatures of Jews, Muslims in Northern European art, those dark-skinned, hook-nosed, snarling tormentors of Christ. The Tatars as voracious, hook-nosed cannibals. More subtle markers of race, genealogies of whiteness and blackness, are encoded in the sculpture of the Doge's palace. A biblical genealogy of race is depicted in the sculpted relief of the drunkenness of Noah at the southeastern corner of the palace. Shem and Japheth cover their father's loins, reacting with horror as Ham, who shamefully revealed Noah's nakedness, is isolated on the other side of the arch. This underlines Noah's curse of Ham and his descendants to be enslaved by his brother's descendants. Over time, the narrative of Noah's sons was transformed by Isidore of Seville and others into the origin story for three distinct races, located in the three known continents: Japheth with Europe, Shem with Asia, and Ham with Africa, considered to be the ancestor of the dark-skinned Egyptians, Nubians, and Ethiopians. Venice's promotion of this genealogical race-making is seen in A Universal History, authored by the Venetian Franciscan Fra Paolino, early in the 14th century. The first part of the manuscript conveys world history in a series of genealogical diagrams, starting with Adam and Eve, but also including ancient Greek gods, Roman emperors, and medieval European rulers. Noah's family tree, shown here, includes Isidore of Seville's map of the world with the three continents to which each son of Noah was assigned as ancestor. Along the right edge of the folio, the African descendants of Ham include the pharaohs of Egypt, who here are represented with dark skin and enlarged white teeth, bloodshot enlarged eyes, clearly caricatured in their faces in contrast to the white figures. This is the same physiognomy used for the Muslim sultans of Egypt. Medieval literary narratives conflated Ethiopians with black Muslims, often misnamed as Saracens or Moors. Drawing on ancient climate theories such as Ptolemy's, medieval natural philosophers, Albert the Great and Bartholomew the Englishman, argued that their proximity to the equator and the hot sun dictated humoral imbalance, deviant physical appearance, and also character. By contrast, a genealogy of white Venetian ancestry was traced to the Trojans. In Fra Paolino's World Chronicle, Trojan bloodline is juxtaposed with the map of Venice, and a text describes how the great-nephew of King Priam of Troy, Priam Junior, founded Venice after fleeing Troy, just as Aeneas was said to have founded the city of Rome. In keeping with the promotion of the Trojan warriors as heroic knights in the medieval Roman de Troyes, Priam appears as a medieval knight in chainmail. Venice's Trojan connection is highlighted by a capital on the west flank of the Doge's palace, in which Priam appears as the first of a series of ancient rulers, culminating in the Roman Emperor Octavian, under whom Christ was born. This meaningful juxtaposition alludes to Venice's recent claims to Trojan lineage and its rule over a large part of the Eastern Roman Empire. At the same time, the visual language marks a significant contrast with the more naturalistic portrayal of foreigners on other capitals. The stylized images resemble Gothic portraits of French and European rulers with long flowing hair and beard and mustache, crown and lily scepter. The same style is used for the personification of Venice itself as the figure of justice and simultaneously as Mary, Queen of Heaven, which we see depicted here on the palace's west facade. The whiteness of the marble, the elegant elongated proportions, idealized face, and long flowing hair originate in Parisian Gothic ivory figures, such as the one we see here, whose unpainted skins established whiteness as an unmarked European norm, an international language throughout Europe at the time. Complementing this message of assimilation is an emphasis on conversion in the mosaic over the font of the nearby baptistry of St. Mark's. Here, Christ commands the apostles to baptize the nations while condemning those who do not convert. Despite their diversity, all the newly baptized are assimilated to European whiteness in the font, except for the Ethiopians, who evoke the racial trope used to disparage black Africans and then Muslims as a foil for Christian whiteness. The inclusive message of baptism belies Venice's entanglement in the slave trade. In Venetian documents of sale, religion and ethnicity, sometimes complexion, offered justifications for enslavement of Muslims, Mongols, Jews, and even Byzantine Greek Orthodox. Even though the same documents confirm forced conversion to Latin Christianity by listing a baptismal name alongside the original ethnic name. While the majority were Slavic, Mongol, and Circassian women, it is African and Tatar men who are depicted among the enslaved tradesmen in another capital of the Doge's palace, and black Africans who appear as water carriers on the west facade of St. Mark's, and then the shackled slaves and the claws of griffins and lions adjacent the south porch of St. Mark's. Ultimately, then, a metaphorical blackness, sustained Venetian whiteness, and empire. Thank you. Our second speaker is Drew Narayanan, who comes to us from the Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina.
Thank you all for having me. This is a real honor, and I do want to take this opportunity to thank Tom for being an absolute dynamite advisor. So thank you. The main focus of my research is Latin Christian depictions of this pre-modern Islamic supervillain called the Sultan of Babylon, a term that refers both to the historical ruler of Egypt and also a broader abstract ruler of all Islamadom. And like any good supervillain, he's got a whole bunch of awesome powers. He rides panthers into battle, he controls the Nile with an almost supernatural ability, and he even gets dressed up as the kings of Europe and gallivants around the Holy Land. Racialization as a concept has purchased from my work because it well describes the dehumanizing attitude on cultural grounds that Latin Christians held towards this Islamic foe as they sought to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land, a venture that they seemed particularly bad at getting off the ground in the 14th and 15th centuries after earlier, more successful crusades in the 11th and 12th. Here we find a fetishization of imagined victory in the Luttrell Psalter, where an English prince defeats his blue-faced, hook-nosed, fanged opponent. The iconography rhymes with all the tropes that we, as modern people, might easily recognize as a racist depiction. Well, there are multiple problems with this type of approach for understanding pre-modern racialization. First, it's a little superficial. Second, it inadvertently recreates the racializing process, where scholars comb through the most cartoonishly racist examples in the extant material to use as their case studies. And third, and perhaps most importantly, such clear-cut racializing depictions are not always consistent in medieval art. I have found many examples of the Sultan of Babylon appearing indistinguishable from his Latin Christian counterparts, as seen in the left illumination, where he is depicted wearing the royal colors of France, blue and gold. At other times, the Sultan is depicted as wearing a turban, as we see in the right illumination. Now, there is nothing inherently racializing about a guy wearing a turban, because people in the Arab world, in Islam today, wear different types of clothing. So if these markers are not consistent, how can we make an assessment of a racialized character? If racialization is the process by which people, internal and external to a society, cannot ever become full beneficiaries of that society on the basis of geographic origin, religion, or class, then the visual embodiment of that impulse should be identifiable not only in its most explicit manifestations, but also in its most pernicious forms. I certainly think that the racialization of the Sultan occurs in the supposed exceptions pictured here. However, the lens we privilege for understanding race, such as skin color, costume, physiognomy, and accoutrement, are insufficient and inconsistent indexes for a pre-modern context. While these are important signposts, they are not the pistons that power racialization. Instead, I champion for what I call a crypto-visual lens, one that privileges text-image interaction, organization of the manuscript, typography, masquerade, and materiality to pinpoint the site of racialization. So for the remainder of my time, I would like to walk us through one of the metrics that I use for seeing medieval racialization of Muslims, and that being the materiality of gold. Now, those of you familiar with medieval manuscripts will know that these objects are often brilliantly illuminated. What you might be less familiar with is that the implications of that gold differs dramatically in regard to context. The illumination depicts Muhammad proselytizing on the left side. Standing in a desert before his followers, the prophet holds a book absent of any writing, a clear metaphor for the emptiness of Islam. In contrast, Gabriel delivers the correct message to the Virgin in a verdant garden. The deployment of gold aligns with the dichotomous messaging. On the Islamic side, gold illumination communicates the actual material. Here, gold is used to communicate a gold coin purse. Alternatively, on the Christian side, gold only appears explicitly to decorate the halos around the heads of religious figures. The bifurcation of the rock creates a clear distinction. Christianity is lush, meaningful, and focused on spiritual enrichment, while Islam is barren, meaningless, and centered upon materialistic enrichment. Such juxtapositions reinforce European polemics of Muhammad as a greedy merchant alongside Islam as an idolatrous religion. This phenomenon is not singular to one manuscript. Take, for example, this scene from a Crusader propaganda manuscript, which juxtaposes Christ illuminated by his golden mandorla adjacent to the Sultan of Babylon and his court painted in gold color. The lines just below the illumination speak to the Sultan's great wealth as a result of his geographic position. The logic thus follows that as a result of material resources etched into his costume, the Sultan can resist Crusader efforts. Gold here does not simply communicate materialism, but the ability to keep Jerusalem out of the hands of its rightful owners. So let us return to the original example of the lateral psalter to see what a focus on materiality can reveal. What initially appears as a gilded crown upon the Sultan's head is no crown at all, but rather a gilded helmet that has been knocked off by the force of the Christian knight's lance, implying that it had previously covered the Sultan's head in the moments before the viewer encounters the scene. The illumination depicts a Christian knight shattering a Muslim warrior's chivalric masquerade to reveal his monstrosity. Trading in Latin Christian ideas about internal sin manifesting externally, the image also accuses their Islamic counterparts of performing a lie in trying to hide it. In this interpretation, the gold embellishes the Christian hero, while its use for the Sultan suggests that this material has been wrought and shaped for a deceptive and therefore evil purpose. By defeating his opponent, the Christian knight lays claim to the Sultan's arms and armor. The visual narrative promises not only Christian victory over Islam, but provides material evidence for the booty to be found in the Holy Land. The entire visual program engenders a colonial fantasy which twists together the dual benefits of spiritual and financial success for the price of slaying the imposterous non-believer. In this brief presentation, I have tried to deplatform the usual suspects of racialization. No turbans have been counted, no proboscises measured, no scimitars cataloged, and no craniums taxonomized. By focusing on gold materiality as one example, we can identify what makes the Muslim so unincorporatable in the Latin Christian epistemology. They are materialistic, greedy, idolatrous, usurping, and dishonest, as opposed to the same material, when used decorating Christians, hold diametrically opposite implications. There are few constants that we can claim across time and diverse polities, but the value of gold on the whole is a shared one. If medieval Christian deployment of the shared valuable material is so negatively different when used for ornamenting the Muslims as opposed to the Christians themselves, then the Muslims must be morally incompatible with the Latin Christian worldview. When the meanings of the materials become segregated along religious lines, that separation embodies a racializing discourse. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Emerita Gail Geiger.
I'm not sure what's going to happen.
And Anna, I haven't used one of these for a long time. Do I simply change the images here?
Keys. Yep. So that one will advance it.
Okay, there's no way to get it on the whole screen. And okay.
I'll be right here.
All right, it's been a while since I've done this, and things do change. Okay, well, I have a project here that is a complicated one, and I hope I can convey something of the importance for the whole theme. Race and global trade in Venice at the end of the millennium, with Andrea Brustolon's Fornamento Venier. This was commissioned by a Venetian aristocrat, Pietro Venier, and he was an ambassador to the French court of Louis XIV, King Louis XIV, and to the Spanish court of Charles II. And those foreign experiences, I think, do have an impact. The project of 40 pieces of furniture, although, as you'll see, it's not exactly furniture, all of it, were intended for the porteggio of his palace, of that long hall that goes from the facade up to the back of the building. And it would have been a public space, as many of you may know, and where entertainment was taking place. The most complex piece of the ensemble is this table for carrying of porcelain vases. It is with the three black Africans represented in the middle and two river gods on either side, and down below Hercules supports the whole table. This is the piece that is signed that says that it was Venier who ordered Brustolon to make it. The ensemble is complicated. There are three full-scale Ethiopian warriors, clearly with a very mean look on his face, very lightly clothed there, around the genitals, a helmet, a baton on his shoulder, and he and his two fellows are sort of the exception, although there are two female caryatids that are clearly intended for part of the vase-carrying ensemble. One of the most interesting of the group is a group of 9 youthful figures in this ebony, which is very hard to carve, and a wood, as many of you may know, from either Africa or South Asia. Here, standing in this classical contrapposto, but an African with features and obviously that black skin, and draped in a chain, a bit like a garland, and supporting this flat platform for a vase. Normally speaking, the Venetians did not, at least in the Renaissance, show slaves nude, much less in chains. And Veronese's example here of the Wedding of Cana does have slaves, but they're down on the side here, and the sort of detail in the foreground. As you can see, they're all clothed and busy doing various labor. There is a very fascinating monument in the Frari with this tomb and the base across the bottom there with 4 supporting clearly African figures, but all costumed, and interestingly, costumes that have some features, such as the torn knee area, that Brustolon will also use. There is one other comparative model that's of interest at this period, although a bit earlier, the 16th century, the monument in Livorno with 4 so-called for more, again with that complicated allusion to those who are opposition to the Ottoman, well, in the Ottoman area, and who are Moors, and maybe they're black and maybe they're not. In this particular case, they are represented obviously with African features, and they are bound with chains. The ensemble of the Fonamento has this very extensive collection of 5-colored imported Chinese porcelain. There are no documents that indicate whether this was the reason for the ensemble. So many of the pieces, in fact, intended to support such things. As an ambassador, Venier didn't have to declare anything. He simply brought in what he wanted. And so the monuments all have these, or almost all have these beautiful large vases. Venier would have certainly seen the popularity of this sort of imported porcelain from the Far East in Paris, which the Dutch had really gotten going in their international trade. The color of the black ebony and the multicolored porcelain has a fascinating sort of counterpart in the Pietradura work that was popular at the Medici court in the 16th and 17th century. And here you can see with ebony and various beautiful stones or pearls creating the narratives of the various panels. At the French court, there was also a popularity of a table decoration of black Africans supporting some sort of small objects like a coconut shell or a sea shell of some sort, but not the full-scale figures, although there was a development of the standing figure holding a table support, the so-called guideron that you see here in the sketch on the far right. So the context of the Brustolon figures have a very rich sort of background as far as the Italian peninsula is concerned, but also his experiences at the French court. And actually the Spanish court too, since both of those courts were big slave centers. And in fact, in his reports back to the Venetian Republic, he talks about the lower echelon of the French court behaving like slaves in chains. The very large table here is also one of enormous theatricality, and I think that's of interest because of the Venier concern and fascination with the developing art of opera. In the end, the Venier family very strongly supported opera, as did Pietro Venier himself, and they eventually created La Fenice, the most famous opera house in Venice, and were strong patrons all the way through the 18th century. Finally, there's a very interesting connection here with Vincenzo Coronelli, who was a Franciscan friar and a cosmographer and a cartographer, published encyclopedias and things of that sort. And the Venier cousins, Pietro and his cousin Girolamo, were very supportive, and they gave a large map of the Americas to the king, Louis XIV, as a gift at one point. And there's a sort of fascinating concluding image I want to show you here of this African figure, this one, of course, dressed, holding the globe of the world. And it's a fascinating sort of echo of the slave trade, the links with Africa and Europe and the Americas, not to mention, of course, the international trade going on all through the Far East. So the support of the Venier family for Coronelli, it seems to me, is significant in the overall global reach of the implications in this ensemble. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Tanya Tiffany, who comes to us from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really honored to be part of this exciting session. This 16th century view of Seville depicts the city where Diego Velázquez was born in 1599 and lived until becoming court painter in 1623. At this time, Seville was the seat of the House of Trade of the Indies, which regulated commerce between Spain and its holdings in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Ships in Seville's river port bore the spoils of these imperial domains, or what Spaniards called the Indies. The resulting wealth funded several of the churches visible on the painting's skyline, which defines Seville as emphatically Christian, despite its past as a Muslim history with a significant Jewish population. And in the context of this session on rethinking race and colonialism, I want us to keep this history in mind. So during the early modern period, and Thomas Dale has already touched upon this, the Spanish term raza, which is obviously a cognate of our term race, referred to traits inheritable through bloodlines. And so raza in Spain could refer to the supposed stain of non-Christian ancestry, and it could also refer to non-white skin. So the notion of raza at the time involved an intersection of various kinds of difference from the supposedly white or old Christian norm, as it was referred to at the time. The view of Seville is animated by brawling soldiers, bold skinny dippers, if you can see them, and flirtatious encounters. Most of the figures appear to be white, but in the left foreground stands a black woman wearing a simple hat and headdress who proffers goods to a pair of well-dressed men. As the only person of color clearly visible in the painting, her presence alludes to, and yet also elides the importance of Afro-Iberians in Seville, who made up more than 10% of the population and constituted the majority of the city's enslaved workforce. This is a workforce that additionally included Spaniards of Muslim ancestry, as well as captives or prisoners of war from the Ottoman Empire. Seville was also home to a large community of black freed women and men who had negotiated or funded their manumission. Both enslaved and freed people contributed to Seville's prosperity through their labor in local households and industries, and they participated in civic life through confraternities and other associations. Paradoxically, the riches of early modern Seville, which depended upon human exploitation and territorial extractivism, provided an engine for cultural creativity that gave people like Velázquez opportunities for social advancement. And here, of course, we see him at the height of his career as a court painter in Las Meninas. The artist's forebears included indebted artisans and probably converted Jews. So in period terms, the family was likely of what was known as an impure raza. But his father held a position as an ecclesiastical notary, securing the family's place in the Christian community. As an adolescent, Velázquez became the star pupil of the learned painter Francisco Pacheco, who cultivated a prestigious clientele. Pacheco's studio, like others in Seville, also produced pictures for the Americas. Velázquez is not known to have exported works overseas, but his early success was intertwined with Spain's imperial project in ways that scholars are only beginning to consider. In 1620, he painted Jerónima de la Fuente, a 65-year-old nun from Toledo who lodged in Seville's Convento de Santa Clara before traveling to Manila, where, with royal backing, she founded the first women's convent in Asia. Velázquez likewise depicted the founder of a civilian church, we see him on the right, whose construction was financed largely by men connected to the House of Trade. And he leased property near the river to traders or tratantes, and likely others who were involved in American commerce. The production and consumption of Velázquez's paintings was also bound up with the institution of slavery. Like many artists in Seville, Pacheco used enslaved labor in his household and probably in his workshop. In 1630, he sold an enslaved man, identified as Almete, a white slave from the Turkish nation, to a local functionary. Velázquez's father was the enslaver of a woman or child, documented only as Maria, who was baptized in 1621. Velázquez's civilian patrons also practiced slavery. The cleric Juan de Fonseca, owner of the water cellar of Seville on the screen, was born into a wealthy slaveholding family. And the Duke of Alcalá, a major art collector who owned two of Velázquez's genre scenes, among them possibly this picture on the right, relied upon an enslaved workforce. Even convents, including the one where Velázquez painted Mother Jerónima, exploited the labor of enslaved individuals. Velázquez's participation in this human economy was addressed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's recent exhibition on the painter Juan de Pareja, whom Velázquez held as an enslaved member of his studio, and who, after his emancipation, forged his own distinguished career, as you can see from his painting on the screen. In 1650, Velázquez painted this commanding portrait of Pareja and arranged for his liberation, but continued to exercise authority over his person or talent, stipulating, and this was common in manumission documents from the period, that Pareja remain in his service for 4 more years. As argued by the curators of the Met Show, and I know you had a wonderful talk here last year by David Pullins, which I attended on Zoom, as they have argued, it's worth speculating on how Pareja felt about having his likeness used to vaunt the skill of his enslaver. We might similarly ask how the dark-skinned subject of Velázquez's kitchen servant in Chicago felt about having her image painted. This work is a secular variant of Velázquez's Sept, which includes the same foreground and features a religious episode in the background. Like Velázquez's other genre scenes, both paintings were produced in Seville, probably for wealthy connoisseurs. Elsewhere, I've argued that Sept relates to a campaign in the 1610s by Seville's archbishop, who aimed to baptize every person from sub-Saharan Africa who passed through the city, and to the writings of the Jesuit Alonso de Sandoval, who sought to illuminate Black souls with rays of faith. Bathed in the radiance of the religious scene, the woman in Velázquez's painting echoes the disciples who, in a flash, recognize Christ at their table. The composition suggests that despite her earthly travails, the woman will attain the kingdom of heaven. By contrast, the kitchen servant suggests no divine reward. We know nothing about the person who modeled for Velázquez's painting. Perhaps she was the same Maria, enslaved by Velázquez's father, a freed woman in domestic service, or a vendor on Seville's streets, as in this detail that we've seen. Regardless, she would have numbered among the people of color whose contributions to Seville's economic and cultural preeminence are an increasing focus of scholarly attention. We see the human price of that labor in her bowed head and hunched shoulders. Her absorbed gaze, emphasized by her illuminated brow, conveys psychological complexity. Yet despite the artist's sensitive portrayal of her features, the painting effectively reinforces her subjugated status, placing her on display for Velázquez's clientele. Thank you very much.
Our final presentation comes from Professor Elaine Sullivan of UW-Madison, both art history and African cultural studies.
Thank you very much, and especially thanks to Tom for inviting me to be a part of this panel, which has allowed me to reflect on a footnote in my dissertation and learn from colleagues asking similar questions in very different time periods and continents. This title slide shows a photo of the installation Restore that was completed in 2020 by the artists Aimé Pane and Jean-Pierre Muller in the rotunda of Belgium's Royal Museum for Central Africa, which houses one of the largest collections in the world of African heritage objects, primarily from Belgium's former colony of Congo. Today, I will discuss this sculpture by Mpane, which depicts a skull belonging to a man named Lusinga. Lusinga's life and death are but one of many scenes exemplifying the violence of the early colonial encounter between Europeans and Africans in Central Africa. Lusinga was a chief in what is today known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, living on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in the mid-19th century, where he became a darkly successful participant in the East African trade of ivory and enslaved people. There, he encountered the Belgian military officer Émile Storms, who was working to seize Congo on behalf of the King of the Belgians, Leopold II. Lusinga was in his way, and in 1884, he was killed and beheaded by Storm's mercenaries. And Storms personally brought his skull back with him to Belgium, where it was eventually given to the Royal Museum for Central Africa, before being moved to the Royal Natural History Museum, where it still resides. This is the Royal Museum for Central Africa, originally called the Congo Museum. It was founded 3 years after Lusinga's death in 1897 by Leopold II. This building, designed by French architect Charles Giraud, was completed in 1910, and its centerpiece is a large rotunda with 16 niches, home to various sculptures by Belgian artists. These sculptures include allegorical representations like Belgium bringing civilization to the Congo and Belgium bringing well-being to the Congo. Today, I'm going to focus on this one, which is simply titled Slavery, made by Arsène Maton and installed in 1922. This is a reference to a favorite theme of early colonial popular narratives about the Congo, which depicted so-called Arab slave traders who were not ethnically Arab, but were usually Muslim Africans from the Swahili coast, as exotic, dangerous men whom Europeans had a duty to conquer in order to end the slave trade. This rhetoric conveniently ignored the forced labor practices going on elsewhere in the Congo in service of European corporations. While my fellow panelists have explained the changing concepts of race, in the early 20th century, we are in perhaps more familiar territory. At that time, people thought that they could discern a person's relative civility or degeneracy based on physical characteristics. Depictions of Africans tended not to be portraits, but often adopted principles of physiognomy and phrenology to create somewhat generic renderings. I think that Maton's sculpture was inspired by the illustration on the left by Edouard Triou, who is actually best known for his illustrations of the novels of Jules Verne. This illustration is found in a book by Victor Giraud, recounting his explorations. Giraud, by the way, was very good friends with Émile Storms and lived in the same region in Central Africa. According to the caption, the illustration is meant to depict a man named Makutubu, who, like Lusinga, was a trader who lived on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. In both the illustration and the sculpture, viewers are meant to see that the figures are obviously villainous. In 2013, the museum closed for a 5-year renovation, and when it reopened, it highlighted new works of art by African artists that it had acquired or commissioned to help, quote-unquote, decolonize the museum. Because the museum is listed as a heritage building in Belgium, they were not able to remove the sculptures from the niches. To deal with this conundrum, Aimé Pane and Jean-Pierre Muller proposed to hang semi-transparent veils in front of the sculptures, each with a print that could provide artistic commentary on violent pasts. In addition, Mpane carved 2 wooden sculptures, one an optimistic look toward the future, another contemplating the innumerable dehumanizing representations of Africans that have been on display in this museum for over a century. In front of Maton's slavery, Jean-Pierre Muller designed a veil featuring an image of the sculpture Abduction of a Sabine Woman by Jean Bologna, a Renaissance sculptor who, despite his name, was actually from Antwerp in Belgium. The sculpture refers to the event historically called Rape of the Sabine Women, and Muller used it in part to comment on the instrumentalization of women in stories of war and conquest, including in present-day coverage of the war in Congo, which I will not go into today. Discussing his sculpture of Lusinga's skull with me, Mpane explained that he meant for it to act as a spiritual vessel for Lusinga's spirit, which is likely not at rest due to his violent end and various movements after his bodily life. Mpane considers Lusinga to be a representative of the injustices incurred by Congolese under Belgian colonialism, and in fact, a photo of Lusinga's skull that was shared across Belgian media has become a symbol for demands of repatriation of human remains. This sculpture gives Lusinga a place to talk back, or I guess look back, at these colonial depictions and play a role in imagining a more just future. Thank you.
I'd like to invite all the panelists to come up, and we do have about 20 to 25 minutes, and rather than curate this discussion, I'm going to invite the audience to respond in different ways. Although if no one wants to speak, I certainly have some questions we can discuss. But I think there will probably be some interesting questions. So I would just like to open the floor to questions and comments. And while you're thinking, I'll just thank everyone. And I'll make a brief comment just on how beautifully this came together. We met beforehand so we could think about what we were all talking about. And I think you'll see that there's some very interesting strands that have brought these different presentations together from pre-modernity up to the present. And thinking about the interconnections between enslavement, empire, race, commodification, all of these things, I think, have been nicely intertwined. Yes, Patrick.
My first question, excuse me. My first question is for Professor Moraines. I was wondering if there's a possible sign of racial anxiety with the depiction of the English prince. I should say English. Whatever that was. Sorry. Not like
Plantagenet.
Plantagenet prince wearing gold while fighting the Sultan of Babylon. Because as you point out, these manuscripts are being made not at the height of Latin Christian Empire building, but kind of at their nadir, right? Like it's the Mamluk Sultanates, it's the rising Turkish Sultanate. They're at the height of their empire building, and the Latins are reacting as like, well, why are we failing so much? And there's a idea of like, well, we need to religiously reform. Like when we established our Crusader states, we were behaving like Muslims. We were using Muslim coins with the Prophet's name on it. We were, having too much sex. We weren't performing properly as Christians. And so when we see images, because this isn't the only image of Crusaders depicted wearing gold, right? The image of like the Battle of Nicopolis, for example, shows both the Latin Christians and the Ottoman Turks wearing golden plates. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if perhaps such images also point to a fear that like when we wage these crusades and when we lose, it's because we are assimilating to their vanity and to their sinfulness. Thank you.
I think that might have been. I think that might have been true, maybe earlier on in like the 12th century and the 13th century, but I think that I don't think that is as true in the 14th and 15th. I think what's going on in some of these images, I do think that there's an anxiety. I think the anxiety is that like, look, here's a down payment, like a guarantee that you're gonna go and get it. Here is the Christian prince dressed in gold. You've already got some of the like moolah. Those guys over there, they've got gold that you need to go get and make it good Christian gold. And here is the manuscript that you already own and hold in your hand. This is like kind of down payment on what you're gonna go do, even though you're like the English and constantly going to promise to go and not actually, right? That's the anxiety, right? It's like constantly promising to go, not going, and having to still feel special about it. So I think earlier on, yes, but later in this period when they're not doing jack, no.
Jennifer?
Thank you. These were really fascinating papers. It's really good to see some that I've heard before and new material and what people are working on. So actually my question is kind of for Tanya, but for everyone. It makes me realize that I studied the medieval Islamic world, and I'm always kind of contrasting slavery in that context to American chattel slavery. And that I actually don't really understand how slavery in 17th century Seville worked. I mean, were we looking at, if you could just unpack that context a little bit, because in the Islamic world, of course, we have people who rise to be sultan who are slaves, and your sons are not slaves, and it really is a very different kind of slavery, and I don't actually know what Seville slavery was like.
Yeah, so I mean it's a is this on? Perfect. So I don't have to shout. So it's a great question. So slavery in Seville looks different from that, but it also looks different from slavery in the Americas, even though Seville is actually a required sort of stopping point for people who are being enslaved, being taken from sub-Saharan Africa, and sent to the Americas to be enslaved. So in Seville, it's obviously, in Seville per se, it tends to be a sort of a more urban phenomenon. It pervades a lot of the white or so-called white classes during this period. So I mentioned that Velázquez's father is an enslaver, but we also know of a number of artisans who held slaves. The number of slaves in the kind of urban context tended to be fairly small, as far as we know, so they're sort of working in domestic contexts. But people like the Duke of Alcalá, whom I mentioned, who is himself never leaves Europe, but has this like imperial legacy. So he actually inherits his ducal title from an uncle who had married one of the daughters of Cortés, right? Who spearheads the conquest and the overthrow of the Aztec Empire. And Alcalá owns a great deal of territory, of course, but he also owns a bunch of factories that in part engage in exportation to the Americas. And so I think in the urban context, it tends to be smaller populations of enslaved people in the hinterlands around the big cities like Seville. There tend to be larger numbers of enslaved people. But I think I'd love to talk to you about the Islamic world. But so one of the things that I think differentiates slavery in Spain during this period is that this practice of manumission that Velázquez engages in with Pareja is fairly standard. So this is something that enslaved people can sometimes negotiate. They can sometimes purchase their liberty. This is something that could also happen like over generations.
Are their children automatically enslaved?
Their children, once you have been manumitted, your children are not enslaved.
If not manumitted,
The children are, yes, the children of the mother, and usually in relationship, in mixed relationships, it's the mother who's the person who's enslaved. So I don't know if that answers your question. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, I would love to talk after.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I thought I was going to have to yell to emote this, so thank you for this. So delighted to see all of you here. So delighted, of course, to hear more about Tom's work, but especially delighted to see Gail. and to see how we can think about how her work fits with and differs from the others. And I'm thinking about the fact these are sculptural, public, literary settings, but what you're describing are domestic furniture, furnishings. And we'll hear a lot about this tomorrow, about these are objects. But what do you think about when you think about these things as within this well-to-do home?
I'm not sure what you mean by what do I think about them in a wealthy to-do house.
I guess I'm just questioning is that these are things that people encounter, they're visual, they're tactile, as compared to people seeing these scenes in public settings or sculptural little figures. What's different that it's furniture?
Well, I'm really not sure how to answer your question. I
Course.
think it's a very puzzling ensemble all the way
Yes,
around.
altogether.
And why anyone would want such figures around in such quantity is totally mystifying, which is how I got involved in this to begin with.
Of course.
Since I'm a patronage specialist, and I like to know who bought things and why. And so in this particular instance, clearly servitude is one factor. And if the porcelain had been acquired first and he needed it for display, then presumably the negative views of slavery supporting a variety of things would be appropriate. That's certainly what went on, as Adrian Childs has said in a more recent publication of the role of the African, whether it's a teacup or a major sculpture, always servitude and always at the beckoning call of whoever is in charge. So I suppose a superiority sense. I can't imagine that the aesthetic of the black versus the color of the vases would have been a dominant feature, but you never know. I'm sorry, I'm not probably answering your question.
It's a paradoxical group, which I've always been fascinated by. So thank you for continuing to bring that attention. And again, the juxtaposition of the furniture and the porcelain are just dead on for thinking about the early modern world.
I have to say, I was struck by that question too, the connection with the materials, because part of the imperial enterprise is acquiring the materials, but it's also acquiring the enslaved people who sustained that enterprise.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, that it was very interesting. This, I mean, you wouldn't find in the same period in Venice figures of ethnic Chinese, for example, fulfilling that same supporting role.
No.
They would have been viewed in a very different way. So I think that's really interesting to think about those distinctions, those racialized distinctions.
Thanks so much, all of you. It's good to see you up there, and I look forward to saying hello. My question at the moment is for Professor Geiger. In the very beginning, hi Gail, in the very beginning of your comments, you showed the slide of the whole and mentioned Hercules on the base.
I'm sorry?
In the very beginning, you mentioned the figure of Hercules and the base of the table. What I noticed when then you moved to the image of the slave holding what you called the baston or bastone, which is a walking cane, I was thinking about how what I had noticed was the exact similarity of Hercules' club, which is a mazza. A club that he carries was just the same at the base. I had to put on my glasses and squint, but just the same as that which is held by the slave. So I'm wondering if you'd like to speak to the repetition of what is identifiably Hercules' mazza, which is a knobby olive wood, typically olive wood club with the spikes in it, that gets larger towards the top. And so far what I'm going to let you answer the question, but I was thinking about giving that same club to the sculpture of the slave. Is that perhaps connecting the slave to the labors of Hercules, or could it be a comment on the physiognomy of the slave as one who can, like Hercules, who has the strength to carry such a matzah? Because that's the other side of it. It's not. It's that one is that Hercules uses the club to stun the opponent. I mean, kills the dog with it, but to stun. And the other is that carrying the club, having the strength to carry the club itself, separates Hercules from other half-humans.
You're speaking of the large Ethiopian
Yes,
male
I'm
figures
yes,
with the club,
mhm,
yeah.
exactly. The Club of Hercules is reiterated there, and it's very recognizably the
I
Nabi.
suppose if one
the Nabi
really
club.
wanted to link things like that, I'm not sure how much that really would have reflected the purpose, but it's conceivable. So those large Ethiopian figures do seem to be the kind of thing that maybe you put on a staircase. I don't know. I mean, are they to protect the ensemble? Who knows? It's an interesting question. I really don't know what the answer would be. There have been people trying to speculate about thematic significance here and there throughout the ensemble.
I was thinking of the club as a symbol of the strength and the
Possible.
understanding of the Ethiopian physiognomy by the person who commissioned.
Conceivably so, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This was a great group of talks. I have several questions, but I have one for you, Elaine, but I can ask you later because I can see you later. So the other question I have is for Tanya. Because your discussion about the enslaved Black woman towards the end of your talk and how you were approaching it reminds me a bit of like Saidiya Hartman's work. And I know you mentioned in response to Jennifer's question that like the differences between like the transatlantic slave trade and that in Seville. But and you also mentioned this kind of turn towards looking at these figures. So I'm curious about like what kind of methods are available to do so. Like is it kind of like this kind of like Hartman-like speculative approach? Is it like what kind of archival presence is there, and like whose voices go into thinking about how this person might feel?
So I like your reference to Hartman. I think, and I love her kind of speculative approach to these things, which isn't what I do, but I find it really productive. I think in part we can we can engage in some informed speculation based on information that's really starting to come out. It's just really started to come out in the last 10 or so years. So I've been working on Velázquez for a long time, and I've been thinking about these pictures for a long time, but it's recently, and I think with endeavors like the Juan de Pareja show at the Met, but also work by a lot of other scholars, that we're starting to get a sense of the lives of enslaved men and women. And I should say, just to emphasize, that enslaved men and women during this period aren't simply sort of people who would have been identified as Black. They're also, sort of the white slave who was enslaved by Velázquez's teacher Pacheco. And I think what scholars are starting to do is to try to read the documents against the grain, that we can get little bits here and there about lives. And obviously, these aren't people who tend to be able to write their own narratives. So it's things found in notarial documents, and scholars working on slavery in Seville have done a lot with thinking about like artists' workshops and the roles of enslaved people in artists' workshops. And there's been a lot of sort of, I think, very plausible discussion of the role that enslaved people must have been playing in these workshops. And one of the things I'm really interested in, and so far I think we don't have the evidence to get at this, but we know that there are a lot of enslaved women who are working in the households of artists, and the assumption, I think, has been that enslaved men who are in the households of artists are probably doing things in the workshop. But we're also learning a lot more about women artists in general during this period, sort of women as makers, women working in workshops in ways that don't get credited. So to return to this notion of like intersectionality, which we've been thinking about today, I think we're starting to get there, and I think it's a lot of slow archival work, but then also some scholarly imagination that allows us to think about what these spaces would have looked like and what they would have looked like for enslaved people, but then also people who had earned their manumission, who had sort of managed to negotiate for that. Thank you.
Hi. So it was great to just see everyone's presentations and see some research that I'm already kind of familiar with, and also research that I'm not familiar with. I had a question for Professor Sullivan, and it's a bit of a broad one, so feel free to say so. But this Restore project I thought was very interesting in that, well, the museum is, of course, like a colonial institution, right? And this museum also could not remove these kind of like golden statues that these artists were trying to address. And that kind of refusal is because it's considered cultural heritage, but the idea of that being cultural heritage is also institutional, right? So I guess my question is, how, in your perhaps in your scholarly opinion, how would we continue to show like contemporary Black art and Black artists in like colonial institutions, and if there is a future of African art in museums, like if there is a future in museums, is there also a future in, say, like biennials or art fairs? And I know, big question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That is a question I grapple with every day. I interpret it in a slightly different way, but it's a similar issue of how do you decolonize a museum that is by definition outgrowth of the colonial project. And I think museums in general are an outgrowth of the Enlightenment and the dark side of modernity being coloniality. And so are you kind of implicated just by having your art on view in a museum? And I will address this by saying that I've talked about this with all of the artists. For my dissertation, I got to interview every artist, every contemporary living African artist who has artwork on view in that museum. And I asked them about this. And most of them said, it's a good opportunity for us. In some viewed it, so for example, in the installation in the rotunda, and that was specifically an installation and not an acquisition that was, designed for that space in order to address certain situations in which the artists, yes, so it was Eme Pane who was first asked. He actually first started with just one sculpture that was like the optimistic, forward-looking one. The museum reopened, had a big party, and every single review was like, why are these horrible sculptures still on view? And so they went back to him and said, hi, can you add to your installation? And he said, yes, I'd love to. And asked his friend, Jean-Pierre Muller, who had a studio next to his, can you join me and let's come up with something? But then that project being explicitly trying to change narratives and highlight also narratives. Whereas some other artists are saying, like, I also live in the world that we all live in right now, and I'm trying to make a living as an artist, and having an artwork in a museum is also a good opportunity for me. I also want to say something I heard in your question, which you may not have meant, which is also how, in this instance, Belgians also grapple with the fact that their cultural heritage is also one of colonialism and oppression, just as much as a building might be, just as much as a Van Eyck might be. And that's another question that is coming to the fore in Belgian conversations today that they're really struggling with, but artists of African descent in Belgium are playing a very important role in highlighting these questions and that these conversations have to happen. So thanks.
Okay, one very brief question.
Cool. Hi, thank you very much. I was wondering about, so, like now we have a lot of talk about decolonization, and it's really very important work. And I was wondering, in all of your work, if you came across people contemporary to these artists who said, this is not right, these depictions are terrible, this is gross. Have you ever heard of people or read criticisms from the time period? Anybody? Like from any of the periods?
Well, I do, but I'm I'm an outlier on this panel. So I guess one point I didn't get to say, but now I just get to say all the things I didn't get to say, is so this idea of, hey, we're Belgium and we're going to take over the Free State of Congo to quote unquote end slavery grows out of the late 19th century or the 19th century European preoccupation with ending slavery all over the world, especially led by the English. And so you can tell that they're taking the rhetoric of the abolitionists and saying, we will take on this cloak of, being a great savior, and therefore you will also give us Congo. And so it's not to directly answer your question, but there is this idea of slavery being bad, but then it's countered by the actions taken within colonies. And then we can't depict, it's bad to enslave Africans and to oppress them, but therefore we are going to in a different way. It's kind of what's happening.
And I think, just super briefly, but so I think for the 17th century in Spain, there's certainly during this period, there is a lot of anxiety about colonization and the evils of it. There is, in some circles, not all circles, but in some circles, there's certainly an awareness of that. But I don't know of any instances where it extends to talking about images, but I think that also just might be a question of the number of images that get written about in that sort of way during this period, that we don't have this kind of tradition of art criticism where people are going to be talking about images in that way. So
I can say that parallel narratives of colonization and racialization run on opposite confessional lines. So the Mamluks are saying, or sometimes doing, not quite with the same level of racial technology, but when you take over a city and rip out a Gothic cathedral and drag it back to Cairo and install it into an Islamic madrasa and use a Christian porch as the edifice of your Islamic religious building, and it's dragged by Christian slaves. I don't know, man. It's pretty freaking racist too, right? So I would say that in my case at least, the Muslims are not simply oppressed. They've got their own racial technology that they're employing against Latins. Say again. Well, no.
Just in terms of my area in medieval Venice, I mean, I have been focusing on the racialization aspect, but a more nuanced view would point out that manumission was common, and in many cases there were collaborations. The Venetians were very practical. They were into business, and so if they could make good collaborations with the Mongols, if they could make good collaborations with the Mamluks, they would do so, sometimes even going against papal interdicts. So I'd suggest to you that there's often a kind of an official language of race that is pan-European, and then beneath that there are also the practicalities of relationships that can sometimes be very strong and very positive. So I would want you to be aware that there are some greater subtleties. I've presented today, one side of things that is focused on the racialization, but then the Venetians are very practical, and there are some counter narratives that I'm also trying to uncover as part of this project. Gail, did you want to add anything?
No, fine, thank you.
Well, I think we will sadly have to bring this session to a close so that we can start the next session on time, on the hour at 4 o'clock. And I invite you all to stay for that. And if you have questions for our speakers, please do come up to the podium while we're waiting for the next session.
All right, everyone. All right. Thank you, Richard. There's a door back over there too, which, if you don't mind, that would be great. Just the interior door. I think we got it, Richard. Thanks. All right, welcome everyone to the last of our panels for today. I'm Anna Andrzejewski, the sort of organizer of the Centennial Celebration Committee and also the Frank Lloyd Wright Professor of Modern American Architecture. And I'm really excited about this panel called Alumni Voices Beyond the Art History Degree. And I'm so tickled pink. But before we sort of hear from our panelists, I can't help but begin this by commenting on a piece that appeared in the New York Times on August 10th that was about the poor computer science majors that cannot find jobs. And actually, in that article, they gave some interesting statistics that I thought would be appropriate to share, that the current rate for unemployment after completing a bachelor's in computer science was higher at 8% than art history at 3%. So, with that in mind, I just think that's so appropriate for this panel. But as you'll hear, that hardly means more art historians. Instead, I think it suggests that the humanities fields, like art history, prepare college students for a variety of careers. And certainly, an academic career in art history is one of those. We'll hear about that. But there's also all sorts of other fields that our graduates go into. And so today we're going to hear from former graduates as to how their time in art history here helps prepare them for an array of careers. But we also want to learn from them how we as a department can continue to prepare students to work in the sciences, in healthcare, in law, economic development. What are the skills that we as faculty members can impart for the next generation? So it's going to be a packed panel. We have an hour, but we're going to do it. We have eight panelists, and we're going to get through it. So I'm going to begin, and I think we'll start. We're going to go left to right on this first one. I'd ask the panelists to please introduce yourself. Tell us when you were at UW, what your relationship was to art history, any other majors, and what you're doing today professionally. And in the big rush at the beginning, I forgot to give the panelists copies of the questions, so I will also have you guys pass these down as we go. But Adam, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, excellent. Hi, Adam Burkhoff. I'm a partner at a law firm by the name of DLA Piper in Chicago. I found my path to art history on my very first semester here, and I was hooked. I think it was Professor Dennis, and it was a survey course of, 101, I think it was, maybe 102, I can't remember. But in any event, I ended up becoming a real estate lawyer, of all things. While I was here, I majored in art history because I fell in love with it. I majored in economics because I felt that it might have some bearing on the business community. And I got a certificate in integrated liberal studies because I was passionate about it. So I am just thrilled to be here today. I'm thrilled to be back. I see at least one of my former professors, and it's really an exciting thing to be part of this. So thank you all.
Hello, I'm Lydia Malamed Johnson. My time at Madison was between 2006 and 2010, and I majored in art history with certificates in European history and Italian. And similarly, my European history certificate came because everything I was doing in art history really seemed to just go back to the history, and it kind of had a bearing on other things that were happening in Europe at the time. I am the executive director of the Association of International Photography Art Dealers, a professional organization of galleries around the world. And our flagship event is an art fair once a year at the Park Avenue Armory in Manhattan called the Photography Show. And I think that was all I was supposed to say.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Happel. My path at UW, I came here in 1999 through '02. I originally started a BArch program in architecture at Tulane University in New Orleans, and I was one of the few people in that program who actually loved the theory and history surveys. So I eventually dropped out of architecture, still loved the architecture and history and theory, found my way here to Madison as a transfer student, and immediately fell in love with the program. I don't believe I have a certificate in anything else, but I took so many credits in Slavic, Russian art, architecture studies, literature, Soviet and Russian culture that I almost didn't graduate on time because I didn't realize I needed to take other classes. So, Anna was actually responsible for getting me my first job in historic preservation with somebody she knew from the program. So I did a couple years of preservation, went back to school, did some urban studies at UW-Milwaukee, and then the architecture bug was still biting, so I went back to grad school for architecture, and I'm currently an architect and an associate principal at Kaler Slater in Milwaukee, focusing primarily on historic preservation, adaptive reuse, and tax credit projects.
Hi, everybody. I'm Katie Reinhardt. I was an undergrad here between 2001 and 2005, so this is the 20th anniversary of my graduating from UW, so I'm particularly nostalgic. I was also a history of science major, and I had a certificate, I think, in European studies, which sort of happened on its own from the classes I had to take for these majors. And my great regret, I had an amazing time at UW, but my one and only regret was I was one course away from a certificate in integrated liberal studies. I didn't stray far. I'm still an art historian, but my path there was circuitous. I went and did my MA in Johns Hopkins in history of science. Then I worked at the Baltimore Museum of Art for a little while, had unfulfilled art historical questions and research I wanted to do. So then I went and did my PhD at the University of Cambridge. I was peripatetic and precarious for a while, including a year of a Solmsen Fellowship here at the IRH. I was here in the kind of 2020-21, so kind of the COVID year. So I had great virtual fellows, including Tanya Tiffany was in my cohort then, and I stuck around for another year when I met kind of more recent fellows, and now I'm an assistant professor in the art history department at the University of Binghamton in the State University of New York system. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, sure.
Hello, I'm Krista Carpenter. I received my bachelor's degree in art history in 2011 with a Middle Eastern Studies certificate, but I also fulfilled a pre-med track. Growing up, I wanted to be an artist, and over time, I also wanted to work in healthcare. When you sign up for pre-med, they advise you to choose a major that will help you stand out, so I was excited I could do both. After graduation, I had to decide on post-grad course, so I had to choose and commit to either healthcare or the art history route. Thanks to professors' vernacular architecture and historic preservation classes, I was very interested in that career, but I did end up choosing nursing school. And I'm currently an infection preventionist here in the Madison area.
Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Welke. I came to UW-Madison in 2012 for graduate school, studying American material culture, decorative arts, and a bunch of other things while I was here. I decided to leave graduate school at my master's in 2014 and worked at the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago for a bit before coming back to Madison to be one of the art coordinator curators at UW Health and the health system here. When that position changed into being in charge of signs in the hospital instead of art in the hospital, I had a bit of a quarter-life crisis and reinvented what I wanted to do and how I could use my art history skills. So I ended up at the UW Foundation, working for fundraising for the College of Letters and Science and the School of Human Ecology, before crossing University Avenue to work here at the university. And I currently serve as the Director of Strategic Initiatives for University Relations for UW-Madison. It's a bit of an odd role. I wear many hats supporting our relations portfolio, so federal, state government, tribal relations, community relations, and business engagement.
Hi, I'm Katie Kalashewski. I was here at the UW from 2004 to 2008. I was an ambitious triple major, so I have an art history. I majored in art history, classical humanities, and history, which served me well because then I chose to go on to Cornell University and graduate with a historic preservation planning degree in 2013. I worked then as a cultural resource professional for 7 years at a local engineering firm, Mead & Hunt, where I did surveys and completed compliance work under the National Historic Preservation Act's Section 106 work. I then moved to our State Historic Preservation Office for 1 year, and I have been with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation for 5 years now, helping manage their architectural and archaeology Section 106 program.
I'm going to add in there that Katie is also currently, chair of the Madison Landmarks Commission.
I knew that.
I did not know that. Oh my God, they're all so smart. I never got a certificate. I was just like in the bar or something. Jeez. I'm Sam Crownover, and I finished my undergrad here with a BA in art history in 1991 and an MA in art history in 1994. So during grad school and then afterwards, I worked at Tandem Press, first as an assistant curator and then as curator. And I also worked at the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice and then at the Venice Biennale, which is where I learned to really love life. I started at Madison and then I pursued that, in Italy too. So I've been back in Madison. I live in Madison, and for the past 27 years, I've been a consultant, an arts consultant to many different things, including an arts co-founding an arts enterprise program at UW-Madison with a musical colleague of mine, and also being in charge of the producer of an international endeavor called Performing the Jewish Archives. But my main job is I run a chamber music festival. It's called Bach Dancing and Dynamite Society. I've been doing, this will be my 28th season. And, it's start like in printmaking. It's a niche portion of a greater fine arts genre. And I really enjoy that. I also have always loved architecture. My MA thesis was in architecture, and I recently finished the restoration of a historic house in Arena, Wisconsin, built in 1868 by a Southern human rights champion, and it's on the National and State registers of historic places. So thank you very much. We got $64,000 worth of tax credits, and I want to talk to the preservationists. And my latest project right now is going to be a consultant to the Women Artists Forward Fund, and it champions Dane County women visual artists. So that's enough about me. I'm making up for it, what I didn't do in college. And
Wonderful. You guys are so sticking to time. This is great. Second question, we don't have to go in order on this, but I hope to hear from everyone. Looking back on your time in the art history department, what are some classes or experiences that were particularly impactful? And I mean that it can be for your career, your work, or for life in general. Please talk about those. And they can be, as I said in my notes here, they can be positive or negative. We like the positive, but
I could start. If everyone's familiar with the Blue Book exams, I think it's kind of unique for humanities type degrees. It's where they give you a notebook and you write everything you can about the subject on the screen. That stands out a lot because it also requires excellent writing skills and communication and grammar and all that is all also graded, not just the information. I remember clearly the feedback, the marks all over. This is fluff, not facts. Fluff, not facts. And that really stands with me today in healthcare, writing policies, procedures, staff education, patient education, things like that. Along with that type of exam is the ability to perform meaningful research, which has always been important, but it's seeming very, very important right now. But overall, the appreciation and ability to continue to enrich my life through ongoing learning, arts and cultures of the world, and keep the humanities in healthcare. Keep the connection.
Wonderful. Thank you, Krista. Anyone else?
So I took a majority of my classes actually in the art history department because there was a lot of crossover with everything I was doing. But I do have to say that I had pleasant experiences in all of my classes. I managed to convince a couple of friends to take Art History 201 with me, which was a really great time for our friendship, particularly late night study sessions where we were attempting to go through all of the pre-made note cards we did so that we would get all the 5 slides Nick Cahill showed us correct. But we still talk about that class to this day, and we still make jokes about that class to this day. I took my first architectural history class with Narciso in the summer of probably 2003, which led me to become a historic preservationist and do architecture. I was really lucky that he that was in the summer, and then in my senior year, he taught an architecture class my first semester, which was great, and he remembered me because I remembered things he said, which he appreciated. And then Anna taught a vernacular architecture class right before I graduated, where we were able to work with the State Historic Preservation Office to work on some research on some houses that did end up getting listed as the Hill Farms Historic District. Not that we did much of that work, but we supposedly helped.
You did. You did help.
Other classes that I really enjoyed, I took a really great materials history class with Gail Geiger as one of my pre-seminar classes, and I still think about that class to this day. That class really taught me how to talk through things, and one of the last things that we had to do was just come up with an idea for a paper and come up with a bibliography, and that really taught me how to dig into archives and kind of look everywhere to see where I could find something that would support what I was talking about. And I had that was just a really interesting class. And then Professor Phillips gave me a lifelong interest in Japanese prints. I got to take a seminar my seminar class was on Yoshitoshi's 36 Ghosts. Sorry, I wanted to say 36 Ghosties because that's what we called it in my friend group while I was going through it. But that was a really great class and taught me a real appreciation for Japanese prints, as well as someone else said, critical thinking and working through the facts and doing the kind of research that you need to do.
There were kind of similarly, and I imagine there's going to be a lot of crossover between all of these, but for me there were 3 distinct pieces to what I learned, kind of larger than art history, and they all have direct call-outs to professors that I had. The first one was kind of learning how to read a work of art, and that definitely came through iconography with Jane Hutchison, and continued the late great, who actually, I'm a 3rd generation art historian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My mother was here for undergrad and her master's, and my grandmother for undergrad, and so Jane actually had taught my mother, and so I walked into my first class completely intimidated by what she was about to teach me, and I left obsessed with iconography. And that continued with Professor Geiger, who ended up being my advisor throughout my honors seminar. And kind of what I also received from Professor Geiger was the research, the knowing what is fact, but also being able to interpret what you were reading from another time and into now, and how you might find new interesting thoughts or entries to what we were looking at now. And that continues with Nancy Rose Marshall, who I took a Victorian art history class with, and that really helped me to situate art and what it was trying to say about the cultural zeitgeist at the time and exactly how it was the visual representation of that. And that helps me a lot in what I do professionally and just my own critical thinking in kind of the visual organization of something and how we move through life, how we present ourselves, all of these different ways that the visual representation of something can be so powerful. And we see that in politics, and we see that in all those different things, and that kind of those different classes at Wisconsin really kind of bring all of those pieces together for me. And that's what I absolutely love about art history. That's what I'll always remember about it.
So one class that stands out in particular for me that's directly applicable to my current job, my first course that I ever took at UW-Madison actually was Methods of Material Culture with Lauren Croyce, and it was all about material culture here at UW-Madison. So part of my role now is I often take legislators and people from different federal agencies around campus to see projects that might interest them, funding opportunities, et cetera. And so I learned so many random things about our campus from that class, and like cows being stuck on ramps and stories at Allen Centennial Gardens. And these are all little anecdotes that I can pull out when I'm with our legislators and people interested in supporting UW-Madison. So I draw on that daily. And I recently kind of culled the materials that I still had from grad school, and I didn't get rid of any of those because you never know when I have to read up on that. But perhaps not as directly applicable to my career, but to my life. My courses with Anna Andrzejewski definitely stand out, especially I took 2 classes with her surrounding neighborhoods here in Madison, Sunset Hills and Westmoreland. And I just thoroughly enjoyed driving through the neighborhoods, trying to figure out the role that space played in the planning of the neighborhood, the different social controls, everything that was at play there. It also, that course taught me all that you can find in the city of Madison's records and how fun it can be to go on a deep dive through property records. And perhaps inspired my nightly routine of checking the MLS and always just looking at houses available in Madison and different neighborhoods that I might want to explore and learn about.
Well, first of all, I forgot to mention I was here from 1987 to 1991, along with my dear friend Sam at the other end, who really helped foster my love for this group and this discipline. You might ask what a real estate lawyer has anything to do with art history, and the answer is very little. But what it does let me do is really enjoy and appreciate art outside of my practice. Makes me a much more full human being. My wife and daughter who are here, hi. We went to the Louvre and the Musée Jacques-Marandré and the Musée d'Orsay and the National Gallery, and this week we're going to see the Kayabat exhibit at the Art Institute, and the passion remains. My wife and I and daughter, we collect art, and it just makes life whole, right? I will tell you there is one crossover. As a real estate attorney, we live in Chicago, and I specialize in high-rise mixed-use development, and specifically I help clients divide up buildings. So I've become quite a student of how buildings work and function, and I need to draft the 150-page document that goes along for the care and feeding of that building for its eternity. And one of the buildings I worked on was part of the Gage Group in Chicago, and the decorative facade of the Gage Group was designed by Louis Sullivan. And I was here with my wife and daughter, I don't know, 10 years ago when my daughter was in school here, and we were walking through the Alveum, and there in the Alveum is a piece of the facade of that building. So there is some connection.
So I've been thinking a lot, not just for this event and kind of general nostalgia, about the courses I took here at UW, because I've newly become the director of undergraduate studies for my department. So I'm thinking a lot about curriculum and majors and what we want them to take from it. So I'm actually I'm equally curious what everyone says in this panel. And as part of my position, I teach the first half of the survey, which has to be one of my answers for this question, which is my first semester freshman year, I was in Nick Cahill's Art History 201, definitely because I probably had a late SOAR date and there weren't, it was just, I didn't know anything about art history. I definitely had no exposure before coming here, and just that course, and then the second half with Nancy Roche Marshall in the spring, just really, really hooked me. And then, I didn't come in planning to study art history, but just kept taking classes because I found it interesting. And so I feel like the survey is often, it can be quite problematic and it's often misaligned, but the opportunity of a survey to every time I don't study ancient art or modern art, I work on the early modern, but when I have to teach Assyrian relief, I think of Professor Cahill. And many courses taught by many people here that were all, I think, influential in their own ways, even ways that I think I didn't realize then, but realize now. But the other one I'm going to mention is something also far afield from my own research, but was Anna Andrzejewski's class on modern art in the first half of the 20th century in America. And I'm sure I took it because it fulfilled some requirement. And just, it wasn't one I signed up because of a particular interest, but I remember the course really stuck with me because it was the first course I took that really had an argument, right? Thinking about art and objects beyond just, this is this and this is that, but, their context and that meaning that has always really stuck with me and really informs kind of the teaching and things I've done since. I also found all of my notes and flashcards recently, which are pretty good, except for in Gail Geiger's Italian Baroque art history class, I, not yet exposed to any Italian language, really phonetically spelled all those names in a way that's pretty embarrassing. Pretty embarrassing now.
I actually still have all my notebooks too, and it's pretty funny to see how the semester starts and how it ends in terms of penmanship and extensive notes. Couple of things stand out for me in particular. Number one, coming from an architecture, academic architecture background, being in an architecture school, very steeped in the Beaux-Arts through modern, quote unquote, high style, erudite architecture. So when I got more into the history and the theory and the surveys, when I came to Madison, it actually started at Tulane. Professor William Kraft Brumfield was a professor of Slavic studies, and it's the iconography and the wooden churches that really caught my attention. Didn't know what vernacular meant at the time, but I knew it kind of viscerally struck me. So when I came here, I saw these courses on Sullivan and Wright and Narciso, and sure enough, I signed up for all those awesome, he's world-renowned scholar of those things, but it was Narciso's Cuban vernacular architecture class, and then Anna, all of Anna's classes. Professor Druel with African art, all these things viewed through the lens of high-style architecture and understanding. The first thing he told us about African art was this colonialist view of this is kitschy, folky, untrained, unacademic art. Bullshit, basically, is what he told us. So that really struck me, and I just was really into the vernacular ever since. So I really took a lot of Narciso and Anna's classes, and it was kind of a yin and a yang because I was studying, Frank Lloyd Wright and Sullivan on one hand, and then studying Barnes on the other hand, cheese factories. Arnie Allen and Finnish saunas. I might be one of the few people who say sauna because of Professor Allen and Bill Tischler, like all of the legends of this vernacular cultural landscapes, all things I had no idea when I was in architecture school. So when I fast forwarded to architecture, I brought all that with me and viewed it through a completely different lens. Some of the biggest rock star architects today are ones who use vernacular forms in a modern way. The second thing I really took away from the program is there's no substitute for actually physically doing, touching, feeling, seeing, experiencing. So a lot of the other people here mentioned the surveys, going in public records. Those teach soft skills as well, learning how to deal with public officials, learning how to do research, but also just being out there in the field, taking a field trip, being in a barn, being in an old cheese cave, being in an old saltbox gable house, being in an old Norwegian church, touching a gravestone that's 200 years old. My wife's here today too. She always jokes that all of our vacation pictures are of corners of buildings.
So, and I touch them all. You know, God is in the details. So, two biggest takeaways for me really: the vernacular and the experience of being out there and doing the actual work and seeing it firsthand. Really no substitute for it. I never got to study abroad. I'm going to hopefully spend my retirement traveling the world. But you can learn just as much from being in a barn in southwestern Wisconsin than you can from seeing, you know, the Pantheon.
That reminds me that those blue books remind me that I spend a lot of money in the writing lab. You had to pay for that extra writing help. But also the phenomenon that we've all experienced, and that is looking at a piece of art on a screen, in a slide, or in a textbook, and cutting, you know, making a Xerox copy of it, and then pasting it onto a note card and looking at it, and then being in a museum or being in a workshop in Italy and being face to face with the real thing. I mean, this isn't just like give you goosebumps every time you think about that happens.
And then trying to explain to someone who's gone to that museum, like, but I studied this.
I saw this. I learned all about it. Yeah, totally. Some more of my more meaningful experiences within the art history department revolve around creating relationships with my fellow students, with my professors. Susie Banger was a huge influence on me. Jim Dennis, he should be here now. He's not. Professor Drool, he is? Where is he? Oh my God, Professor Dennis. That's awesome. Remember this? That ain't no baby Jesus. Don't you love all the stuff that the professors, like the fact that Narciso Menocal would say that all the time? That was hilarious. But I really hungered to just like get inside of another person's mind, unlock what they had to teach us. I wanted to challenge, and I wanted to ask questions, and I wanted to learn how to better understand one another. And art history gave us an opportunity to ask questions, to tell stories, to try to understand one another better. And that's so transferable to anything we could ever experience now. I really relished special things like dinners at a professor's house or tea at Frank Horlbeck's. And then there was a museum class that the art history department offered, and I really loved that too. And then the other things that were adjacent to art history, like being able to study abroad, the Wisconsin Union Theater. I curated a show with a friend at the Wisconsin Union Directorate, singing in choral union, and I think all these things together that opened my world to beauty and creativity just taught me that I could also be creative in my my own academic path and my career path, and I could sort of blaze my own trail, and being a little bit different was okay, because we learned about such a range of styles and people and stories and art all through time that that it just resonated. All that really resonated with me.
Great. You guys are wonderful at keeping to time. Wonderful. So I'm pivoting to another question. So all of you are in different fields. I'm actually going to pick on Katie first, I think, here. All of you are in different fields, but I'm curious about what skills you think an art history degree can provide for your area, whatever that is. Because we're taking this moment to think about what we can do, what we do well already, what we can continue to do to prepare, in the language of certain politicians, today's workforce. But I'm curious. I mean, all of you come from different backgrounds, and I thought, Katie, you might want to be able to, not Kalashevsky, the other Katie. Yeah, yeah. As an art historian, I thought it might be good to hear from the art historian on the panel about skills, and then we can hear from others.
Well, I, along with my department, are equally reflecting on these things. So I don't think I have any kind of particular. I don't think I have all the answers. But I will say, I mean, and it's really struck me in this conversation. It was struck me in my own reflecting. The kind of, everyone had their interests. Everyone has kind of the things that grabbed them and they pursued. But the requirements, at least of the undergraduate degree, to take some breadth, right? That you had to experience art from different geographies, from different time periods. And I actually think for me, coming into, certainly grad students coming into our program, it's very clear when they've kind of had that exposure or not. And even though, as you go up, we specialize, right? Even when you don't stay in art history, you specialize in the nuances of real estate or, specific necessities of nursing and medicine. But I think having that base really has value, perspectives of different professors, different approaches to the discipline. And then things, again, I think it's kind of all been said, skills of close looking, right? Fact versus fluff, writing, kind of research skills, seeing things in person versus just reproduced in our moment when there's kind of many screens, many things reproduced. So I think actually many of the things have already been said.
Yeah, that's to build on Katie's comment of skills on close looking. Something that I often think about is just visual literacy, and how whether you are looking at a painting or a sculpture or a piece of wallpaper, you notice where is this dynamic moment happening that you should be focusing on? What's happening in the background? How are things reacting to, how are people or things reacting to each other? And that is so incredibly important for my work, and just working with people and groups of people with different opinions and trying to problem solve, of having the ability to step back and kind of read the room, read what's going on, what factors are at play. Also, I don't think that you can overestimate how important it is to be able to articulate an opinion, to write. Even with AI, it doesn't get rid of that ability to write and to articulate your argument. And so that's something that I really learned in art history and use on the daily. And many of my STEM colleagues who didn't have that background in the humanities have lamented how they didn't learn how to write in the way that I did, and are trying to learn that now from AI, for better or for worse. I think too, just again, to draw on everything that has already been said, but the diversity of art that you were exposed to in the art history program really opened my eyes to the diversity of experiences, the diversity of people at play in the world around us, and only made me a better global citizen.
I think one of the things that actually none of us have said today yet, but is something also to keep in mind, because it doesn't get said enough in the media, or it gets said in the media, but in the worst way possible, which is looking backwards also does mean looking forwards. So spending a lot of time looking backwards at where we as humans have come from helps us then look forward and understand how we're moving forward. And so I feel that is also something that I hear from particularly engineers who I've worked with and such is, by understanding where we come from, and that's both art history and history, you can see kind of where you're going also. And particularly in this day, I feel as though there's an Onion article that's like, history sighs, repeats itself. And it just feels very applicable today for a variety of reasons. But that history then also, and that art history comes up in the buildings we see today. As Anna said, I'm the chair of the Landmarks Commission, so I do see a lot of, well, why are you doing it this way? Well, we took this one piece off of this building next to it, and we thought it would work well, without truly kind of understanding why those pieces work together. So understanding where we come from can help move us forward and make us better.
So I realized that I think I missed part of the first question in actually explaining what I do. I run an arts organization that represents dealers, but that means that I represent 95 different dealers around the world. And with that comes a lot of different opinions. And what you said earlier about being able to articulate an idea, I find myself so often, not even languages, but translating the motivations or priorities of one element of our organization to another. We represent the entire canon of photography, so this is the beginning to things that are being made with AI today. And so the priorities for that gallery and the priorities for the first one are very different, and the collector base for both are very different. And being able to see the forest through the trees of that and how one might benefit the other is something that I absolutely learned through art history, of being able to know that the perspective on one type of art is not the only perspective on that type of art, and that there are competing narratives and competing ideas about each thing, and that to be able to articulate what one might gain from the other or what one might be interested in from the other is something that I would always look for if we go back to this kind of question in hiring someone. Similarly, that, you know, looking at the past isn't a bad thing. This idea and the ideas that you get in an art history degree at Wisconsin, because of the breadth, because of the different professors who have different ideas and what they want out of a blue book is different, you know, being able to recognize and work through the solutions in each situation. Yeah, that's something.
Well, I just have to say, in my profession, both in my own practice and when I'm looking to hire somebody, you know, it's all about the whole person. And, you know, we're not automatons. And the depth and breadth of a human being can be measured by their world experience. And when I was in college, I soaked up as much of it as I could. And I realized I didn't really touch upon this when I should have in my prior question, but classes that meant the most to me. I told you I couldn't remember what my first class was, but I do remember my first professor, and that was Jim Dennis. And my favorite coursework became passionately 20th Century American, which I never really understood before coming to college. It was the Impressionists and Renaissance and everything that's sort of more popular, and I just loved everything he had to offer, his sense of humor, and so I just want to give that shout out. I will also say that on Blue Books, I remember filling out a Blue Book for Frank Horlbach, and I got a really good grade on it, and then he wrote in red pen on the front, "Your handwriting is atrocious. Are you aspiring to the medical profession?" So I'll just add that.
In the age of AI, Blue Books are back, baby.
Yeah, excellent, excellent.
A couple of takeaways for me in the art history, not necessarily unique to art history or architectural history, but any good humanities or liberal arts education is just something that's been said already, is the ability to think critically. You know, the role of academia in this realm is not necessarily to tell you, you know, what to think, but how to think. It's huge. I could recognize people in the architecture programs I was in very early on who weren't going to make it because they wanted their professors to tell them exactly what to do, and that's not why we were there. So the ability to think critically is something I would always look for in any aspiring candidate, but it's also just what I took away from too many years of education, but I wouldn't trade it for the world, that ability to think critically. The second thing that is unique to architecture and art, in my opinion, is that it's all-encompassing. You can't say geography is about art, but you can say art is about geography. Race, culture, music, dance, theater, politics, religion, all of it. It's, you know, art and architecture is a physical manifestation of all of those things at any given place and time. So I take that with me always, and that's why I appreciate the education I got here so much.
I think, you know, having some distance now from my education, I thought about all, I mean, we all share a lot of similarities in what we value about the art history degree and our experiences. But like I said, having some distance, I'm just thinking back to the museum experience, and that is looking at a piece of art in a museum, you know, that's already been curated, and you have the opportunity to learn about what the particular artist had intended. But you also have this opportunity to let's say you know nothing about it, and how do you feel about it? What does it do for you? These two hugely contrasting things, like what the meaning says, what it's supposed to say maybe, and our interpretation. And you can bring that skill to any job. You can see that might be a skill that a person that's in your employ may possess. Like, again, it's the what am I supposed to learn about this? What am I supposed to know? What am I supposed to represent? And then what's the gray area around it? How can I give some latitude? And I think it's an interesting perspective that studying art history has afforded me. I also think that that we've all learned to entertain. We've all learned how to go where the food is, because after an opening, there's always food. So I think that's been a very important aspect to art history, and you know, that's where I gravitate toward. I hope that we've all learned how to host, and I certainly learned that myself. But just the last idea I had was, again, the learning about something on a screen or in a book, and then rolling up your sleeves and putting your hands in the paint, putting your hands in the plaster, cleaning up a piece of sculpture with a Q-tip. How do you hang a picture on the wall? Is it level? Is it at the right height? All of those things I've learned through art history, and I hope that you know, there's like a public face to that sort of thing. There's a presentation element to the things that we learn in the books, and so the curatorial is a very interesting aspect of what we've learned and what we do.
Well, my role here today is to appreciate the skills of humanities degrees, such as art history and the connection to healthcare. Of course, it's the communication skills, interpersonal skills, attention to detail. But then the humanities, the extra focus on humanities is different cultures of the world, different kind of people, and different kind of personalities. Because in healthcare, you meet a lot of different coworkers and patients every day. There's lots of appreciation for that. The other thing is learning about art is infinite, so I would expect to see an ongoing interest to always learn new things.
I'm sorry to speak twice, but one thing that I wanted to make sure I said, and I should also say that I'm a member of the Board of Visitors that works with the Art History Department closely, so I have a little bit of an inside view of the students now, and I've been so impressed by the Art History Club that they started that I wish had been during my time.
We had one.
You did?
Sam started a Esprit d'Art.
Esprit d'Art, and I got
awesome.
teased for it.
Oh, I wish it had been there for me. But it reminded me, because I was just thinking about that, but it reminded me that one of the things that I love specifically about this art history department is that it isn't, elitist has so many connotations now, but it isn't rigid. So you mentioned when you go to a museum with a friend who's not an art historian and you get excited about something, or they think you're an expert in something you didn't study, they're always like, well, what tell me about this. How should I think about this? And I might be able to say, well, you know, the dog means fidelity or those types of things. But what does it make you feel? What do you think about it? And, you know, I've met so many art historians from so many schools, and we don't need to name names, but it's one of those things that this department in particular gives you all the facts. It gives you the background as we know it, but then it asks you to investigate it yourself and from your own access point. And I think that is so, so interesting in the people that I've seen come out of it. And I think this panel speaks more to that than anything I've seen.
I think on that note, Sam and Adam, we may need to hear about the esprit d'art.
Well, for the record, I did not tease Sam about it. We had some mutual friends who
not.
did. But
Yes, it's
Sam,
true.
I'm going to turn it over to you because you started it, and it was fabulous.
Yeah, well, we took field trips. I mean, I've always been a huge advocate of, like, so for example, when we were in our art history department, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, we never really went across the bridge into the art department. You know, I didn't know a lithograph from an etching, from an engraving. I had to learn it on a slide, and I didn't know all of the processes. So we went over to the art department. We went to Tandem Press. We had artists there was a lecture series. We invited artists here. What else did we do? Anything?
I remember a string quartet at the Union.
Oh yeah,
for
right.
a reception you had. It was fabulous. It was like just meeting different people and just enjoying. I mean, like you said, you know, the things we did outside of the classroom as a group. You know,
602.
Yeah, and
The plaza.
Yeah, exactly. The bar with the tree in it. I don't remember what.
Paul's Club.
Oh yes, yes.
The old Jenna's.
Yeah, yeah, just great stuff. I mean, visiting Professor Dennis's Frank Lloyd Wright house,
Yep.
and you know, the play for Professor Moon's class, and I mean, just all of it. It was life enriching. I don't know how else to put it.
For sure.
It just made me who I am today in the most wonderful way possible. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. We have a few minutes. If there are any questions, I'm willing for any of the panelists, but think about that for a second. Do any of the panelists have any closing thoughts or memories that they'd like to share that they don't feel they... Sam?
I just want to say thank you for inviting us to be here. I haven't been back in this sort of capacity since I graduated in '94. So it's, I feel part of a family a little bit, and that's very nice. Thank you.
Talk into the mic. We want to record this for the record, Jeremy.
Somebody mentioned, you didn't have a party, but I can't think of another program where you're hanging out at your professor's house. Anna had a dinner for us, and I remember at the time you lived over in the Isthmus in somewhat of a vernacular kind of bungalow house, and you're like, Jeremy, you want to be a professor? This is about what you're going to be able to afford.
How'd that work out, Jeremy?
I live in a 1,400 square foot bungalow in Wauwatosa. So.
Yeah.
Professor Binger had us over to her house for her pro seminar, and I still aspire to the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that at least she had at the time.
And it happened in architecture school too, because you're around these people so much in seminars and learning and field trips. One story in particular, I was just telling a friend of mine, we were just texting each other. A couple months ago, I mentioned I was coming here. I was like, do you remember the time that you and I were walking home from the library mall, and Narciso popped out of the Alvium, and we were walking home, and he said, where are you guys going? We're just going home. Hop in. We hop in his Honda Accord, and like 3 hours later, he's dropping us off at my house. Just drove us all around Madison, pointed at stuff, taught us stuff. So there's special moments like that I don't think you get when you're sitting in a seminar, or, again, maybe not unique to art history, but we'll always take it with me.
And I guess when I was in grad school, so Anna very nicely wrote a letter of recommendation for me to go to grad school, and I remember talking, the professor kind of talking about something, and I was like, oh, well, how I was taught was blah, like, I don't even remember. It was about schools or something. I don't remember. But I remember him being like, that's just because you went to the UW-Madison. That's what they would teach you. And I was like, I will say in the nicest way possible, he meant that. He was like, you went to a very socially liberal school. So of course they're going to say that. But this school did give me a very distinct point of view, and I brought it into my life. And a lot of that was from art history classes.
It's wonderful. Any questions from the audience? All right. Why don't you ask it and then I'll repeat it? How's that? Thank you, Teddy. So Teddy, our academic advisor, was asking our panelists, where have you been? Because, you know, he wants to, he heard these stories and he wants to tell our current students about all the wonderful things our alumni are doing. Wonderful. Daniel first, and then, yeah.
Building off what Teddy just said, it's like professors may be the worst people in the world that say what you can do with a degree, because we're the people who like couldn't do things, so we went to grad school. I mean, I just kind of, this isn't so much, maybe it is a question if people have ways to respond to this, but just to kind of reverse the perspective. I mean, I'm an assistant professor in this department, so I haven't been here that long. But you know, I often think about, you know, what would have happened if I, like, what if I had tried to become an architect, or like, what if I went to law school or something? And there's this kind of like, I think when students encounter professors, it's only as professors, so there's an assumption that like this is the only thing they could have ever been. But it's like, it's incredibly actually eye-opening to hear people who took the other path. And I just want to kind of echo Teddy and say that this is actually like really revelatory for me. So thank you.
There's a comment, this is for our audience watching online, about it being from a faculty member in the department right now, about it being really revelatory because as professors, we tell you to become professors because that's what we know. So it's fascinating to hear what they've done.
If I could just comment on that, since I am probably as far removed as anyone from this discipline in my life, in my practice of law. You know, I have a buddy who calls me full measure. I never do anything half measure, and I just soaked it up. Like when I just started, I got hooked, and I just kept, you know, taking as much art history as I could. I started taking graduate level courses as an undergrad. I just wanted everything I could to do with it, and then I started sensing that it was moving from this sphere of passion into something that was becoming more like a vocation, and I never wanted to taint it that way. And so I made a conscious decision that I wasn't going to make this my job. I totally respect and appreciate, and I wonder about that path not taken myself, by the way, but I chose consciously that work doesn't owe me anything. It affords me the opportunity to enjoy my life with my family and art and all the wonderful things that make life worth living. And that was the path I chose.
And I actually have something to share with that comment also, which was for about 2 years in undergrad, I thought I would be a history professor. I was seriously considering it, and I was ready to start doing some additional work with a professor in the history department. And listening to professors talk is what made me not want to become a professor. Weirdly enough, mostly because of tenure and stuff, and I'm very close with my family, so I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So but I was gonna go into history, not art history. But then when I decided I wouldn't be a history professor, I went home to my apartment here in Madison and Googled, what can I do with my art history degree? And one of the lists that came up was historic preservation. And so I Googled what historic preservation is. And if none of you know what historic preservation is, please go look. It's what literally the National Park Service does. We keep it a really good secret because we apparently don't want people to get jobs in it. But it's basically what you can do with your art history degree and still do art history for a living without getting a PhD. But we are lucky here in Madison, we have the State Historic Preservation Office. And so I messaged them and was like, do you want someone to come in and do free work for you? And let me tell you, they were on it. They were like, we absolutely, you don't even want credit? Yeah, come in. We have so many things for you to do. So thank you, professors, for leading me to where I am. A job that is my passion, and I talk a lot about it.
All right, I have to bring us to a close. Oh, Lydia,
Can I
go
add
ahead.
one thing?
Yes, one thing.
Just that kind of bridges the two of you, because I graduated from undergrad, was trying to decide if I was going to get my master's and teach or research or do something. And I was like, I need to work in the art world, make sure I actually like it before I do this. And then I got a wonderful job at a gallery and fell in love with working with art, like working in the kind of monetary sense with art. And so I never went back. And then my career was very topsy-turvy and curvy, and I ended up in arts administration. And what I would say to all undergrads is, you know, professor or researcher aren't the only ways that you can still interact with art with an art history degree. You can take everything you learn in art history and go to other industries. You can also stay in the art world and do other things. There's a lot of options there. So it doesn't have to be one or the other.
That's a great note to end on. I want to, let's have a round of applause for this panel. Please, I've been asked, please avail yourselves of talking with our panelists in the lobby. We have a reception that begins at 5:30. That means the bar will be open at 5:30. I realize it's 5. I've been asked to tell you we have an amazing museum. You're in a museum. Please take this opportunity to go through the galleries. The Chazen Cafe also is open and has beverages for purchase. So about 5:30, the reception starts, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone there. Thank you so much.